4 days from now, the opening ceremony will begin, and the world will do what it always does when the World Cup arrives. It will look up, turn on the screens, and step into the illusion that football exists in a world separate from everything else. For a few weeks, politics, economics, and environmental warnings are supposed to fade into the background noise of celebration. But this time, even before the first whistle, there is a story building underneath the surface of the tournament that refuses to stay quiet, because it is not about football alone, it is about the cost of football at a planetary scale. And according to a newly published report by the New Weather Institute, released just days before kickoff, that cost has reached a level that should fundamentally change how this tournament is understood. The study estimates that the 2026 World Cup will generate at least 9 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, a figure already nearly double the average footprint of tournaments held between 2010 and 2022. But that is not the upper limit, it is only the baseline. When you include full fan travel, intercontinental movement, team logistics, broadcast infrastructure, and the expanded 48-team format spread across 3 countries and 16 cities, the number rises dramatically. In its higher scenario, the total footprint could reach as much as 15 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And numbers at this scale stop being abstract statistics. They become comparisons to entire nations, industrial systems, and annual emissions of small countries that exist on the map as fully functioning societies. In other words, a single sporting event, lasting just over a month, is now projected to operate on the same carbon scale as economies that run year-round. What makes this even more significant is not just the size of the number, but the structure that produces it. This is not an accident, and it is not an external shock. It is the predictable outcome of decisions that were made years in advance, each one justified in isolation, each one rational from a commercial or sporting perspective, and yet collectively forming a system that generates consequences far beyond what any single justification can contain. Expanding the tournament to 48 teams was framed as inclusivity, as global growth, as opportunity for more nations to participate. Spreading matches across an entire continent was presented as modernization, infrastructure sharing, and global reach. Building a commercial model that depends on continuous movement of players, staff, broadcasters, and tens of thousands of traveling supporters was treated as the natural evolution of global sport in a connected world. But when these elements are combined, they create a logistical machine that runs almost entirely on aviation, long-distance transport, and energy-intensive coordination. And it is precisely this structure that the report identifies as the core driver of the emissions surge. Not one decision alone, but the accumulation of all of them, layered over time, without a unified constraint that asks a single question. What is the total cost of this system when it operates at full scale? FIFA, for its part, continues to frame the tournament within a language of sustainability. Official statements refer to environmental commitments, carbon reduction strategies, and the promise of a positive legacy left behind in host cities after the final match is played. That phrase, positive legacy, has become almost universal in modern mega-event planning. It is used in economic forecasts, cultural messaging, sporting development plans, and now environmental policy. But as it is repeated across categories, it begins to lose definition, because it is expected to justify outcomes that are increasingly difficult to reconcile with measurable reality. A legacy is supposed to describe what remains after the event is gone, what improves, what endures, what is built on. Yet in this case, the report suggests a widening gap between the language of legacy and the actual systems being created to deliver it. And that gap is where the tension sits, between what is promised and what is produced, between what is communicated and what is calculated. And so, before a single match has been played, before the first stadium lights turn on and the first broadcast signal goes live, the 2026 World Cup already carries a shadow that cannot be separated from its celebration. Because unlike tactical debates, injury updates, or even financial disputes, this is not a problem that exists inside the tournament, it exists through it. It is built into the structure, embedded in the movement of people, in the geography of the host design, and in the very idea of what this expanded World Cup has become. And that is why this report matters now, at this exact moment, 4 days before kickoff, not because it will change what happens on the pitch, but because it forces a different question entirely. What does it mean when the world's biggest celebration of sport is also one of its largest measurable environmental events? When FIFA responds to concerns like these, the language is always carefully constructed, almost designed to absorb criticism without allowing it to interrupt the momentum of the tournament itself. Official statements emphasize sustainability frameworks, environmental responsibility, and long-term commitments that are meant to reassure without slowing down the system that is already in motion. For the 2026 World Cup, FIFA has repeatedly pointed to its sustainability strategy as evidence that the environmental impact is being addressed in parallel with the event, not after it, not as an afterthought, but as part of its operational design. On paper, that strategy includes reducing emissions where possible, optimizing logistics, and ensuring that host cities benefit from infrastructure improvements that remain long after the final match. But the tension highlighted by the New Weather Institute report is not about whether a strategy exists, it is about whether that strategy has any meaningful influence over the structural decisions that actually define the tournament's footprint. Because when you look closely at how this World Cup is built, the emissions are not coming from minor inefficiencies or unexpected complications. They are coming from the core architecture of the event itself. The expansion to 48 teams fundamentally changes the scale of participation, and with it, the scale of movement required to sustain the tournament. More teams mean more training camps, more qualification travel, more staff, more media coverage, and more complex scheduling across a larger number of venues. But it is not just the number of teams, it is the geography. For the first time in World Cup history, the tournament is spread across 3 countries and 16 cities, creating a network of distances that cannot be bridged by rail or regional transport in any efficient way. Air travel becomes not just a convenience, but a necessity embedded into the design. Every group stage draw, every knockout progression, every broadcast requirement depends on rapid intercity and international movement. And this is where the report's critique becomes structural rather than rhetorical. The carbon footprint is not a side effect of poor optimization, it is a direct consequence of scale combined with dispersion. A system designed to be global in reach inevitably becomes global in cost, and in this case, that cost is measured in millions of tons of emissions. What makes the situation more complex is that none of these decisions were made with environmental ignorance. They were made in full awareness of the trade-offs, but justified through competing priorities that sit at the center of modern sports governance. Expanding the tournament was positioned as a way to increase global representation and commercial revenue. Spreading host cities across North America was framed as a way to maximize infrastructure use and regional engagement. Increasing the number of participating nations was presented as a way to democratize access to the world's most prestigious football competition. Each of these justifications is internally coherent when viewed in isolation. But the report argues that FIFA's climate blind spot emerges precisely from this fragmentation, from a governance model that evaluates each decision independently, without fully accounting for the cumulative environmental system those decisions create when combined. This is where the criticism becomes more pointed, because it shifts from describing outcomes to questioning process. The report does not simply say that the World Cup is high in emissions, it suggests that the organization responsible for it has not built a decision-making framework capable of measuring what those emissions mean in advance, at the scale they now operate. In other words, sustainability is treated as a layer added after the structure is already designed, rather than a constraint that shapes the structure from the beginning. And that difference is critical. Because if sustainability is applied after expansion, after scheduling, after host selection, then it becomes reactive by definition, something that manages impact rather than prevents it. And in a system as large as the World Cup, management is not the same as control. FIFA, of course, rejects the idea that it is blind to climate considerations. It points to environmental assessments, host city agreements, and legacy programs that include investments in green infrastructure and public transport improvements. But the report's argument is not that nothing is being done, it is that what is being done operates within boundaries that do not challenge the fundamental design of the tournament itself. And that is why the language of legacy becomes so central here again. Because legacy implies a net positive outcome after all variables are accounted for. Yet when the structure itself is the source of the largest emissions, the question becomes whether legacy is being used as a descriptive outcome or a narrative tool, a way of framing impact rather than fully confronting it. And so, as the tournament approaches kickoff, the contradiction sits in plain view. On one side, a governing body presenting a vision of sustainability integrated into global sport. On the other, a structural system whose scale and design generate consequences that the same sustainability framework struggles to meaningfully reduce. And between those two positions lies the central tension of this entire story. Whether modern mega-events can truly be redesigned within their existing logic, or whether the logic itself is what needs to be reconsidered. If the climate report exposes the scale of the problem, then what is happening inside the stadium ecosystem reveals something just as important: the pressure this tournament is placing on the human systems that make it possible. Because the World Cup is not only an abstract global event measured in emissions and logistics, it is also a physical experience lived in real time by players, workers, and fans who occupy the spaces where this system becomes reality. And in the months leading up to kickoff, those spaces have been showing signs of strain that go far beyond normal tournament preparation. The most visible of these is the growing concern around heat and player welfare, a concern that has moved from scientific reports into lived experience on the pitch. Studies from institutions such as Queen's University Belfast have already highlighted conditions at certain venues that produce heat stress levels comparable to, or in some cases exceeding, those recorded during previous extreme tournaments. Mandatory hydration breaks are no longer an exception. They are becoming a built-in feature of how matches in certain environments must be managed. And this changes the rhythm of football itself, turning what is supposed to be continuous flow into something periodically interrupted by environmental necessity. But the concern is not limited to temperature alone. It extends into the broader physical load that modern football is placing on players long before they arrive at the World Cup stage. The expanded club competitions, compressed international windows, and increasingly dense domestic schedules have created a calendar that leaves very little recovery time between peak intensity periods. By the time players arrive at a tournament like this, many are already operating at the edge of fatigue accumulation. Injuries to key names, from muscle strains to more serious long-term absences, are not isolated incidents anymore, but part of a wider pattern that medical staff and analysts have been tracking for years. Each injury report becomes another data point in a system that is producing more wear than it is designed to absorb. And when these physical pressures meet environmental stressors like heat and travel fatigue, the result is not just reduced performance, it is increased vulnerability, where even small margins of recovery or hydration can determine whether a player is fit to compete or sidelined before the tournament truly begins. At the same time, another layer of tension is emerging off the pitch, in the infrastructure that surrounds the event itself. In Los Angeles, ahead of the opening matches in the United States, stadium workers have voted to authorize strike action at SoFi Stadium, a development that adds a new dimension to the tournament's already complex buildup. This is not a symbolic protest, it is a procedural step that gives workers the legal mandate to stop work if negotiations fail. The workers involved, cooks, concession staff, dishwashers, and hospitality employees, are the same people who will be responsible for serving tens of thousands of fans during one of the most high-profile matches of the entire opening phase. Their demands are not abstract either. They center on job security during the tournament period, affordability in a city where wages and housing costs have diverged dramatically, and protections related to workplace conditions during a globally significant event. The fact that such a vote has taken place just days before kickoff introduces a level of operational uncertainty that exists entirely outside the pitch but directly affects what happens inside it. Meanwhile, even smaller operational decisions are revealing how tightly the system is being managed under pressure. A recent reversal of FIFA's policy on water bottles, which initially restricted fans from bringing their own sealed drinks into stadiums before being partially rolled back, illustrates how quickly logistical choices can become public health considerations in an environment where heat risk is already a documented concern. What appears on the surface to be a minor policy adjustment becomes, in context, another example of reactive governance. Decisions introduced, tested against real-world constraints, and then revised within days as practical realities assert themselves. And layered on top of this are ongoing concerns around player availability, disciplinary risks, and injury lists that continue to grow as the tournament approaches, each one reducing certainty in a competition that depends on peak physical readiness. Taken together, these developments form a picture that is no longer about isolated issues, heat, labor, scheduling, or injuries, but about convergence. Each system that supports the World Cup is experiencing its own form of pressure, and those pressures are beginning to overlap in time and space. The result is a tournament environment where performance, safety, logistics, and labor are no longer separate conversations, but interconnected parts of the same fragile structure. And as kickoff approaches, the question is no longer whether these pressures exist, it is how many of them can be absorbed at once before they begin to reshape the tournament experience itself. At this point, the question is no longer whether warning signs exist. They are everywhere, layered across climate data, governance decisions, labor disputes, scheduling strain, and the physical limits of elite football itself. The question is what happens when a system becomes so large that it can continuously generate warnings without ever reaching a moment where those warnings meaningfully alter its direction. Because the 2026 World Cup is not unfolding in isolation, it is the product of years of expansion, commercialization, and structural redesign that have gradually increased both its reach and its complexity. Each addition to the tournament, more teams, more venues, more commercial partnerships, more global broadcasting demands, has been justified as progress. And in many ways, each individual step made sense within its own frame of reference. But what the accumulation reveals is something harder to dismiss, a gap between the scale of ambition and the capacity of governance systems to fully measure the consequences of that ambition once it is in motion. The climate report, the labor strike authorization, the injury crises, and the repeated policy reversals are not separate narratives competing for attention. They are different expressions of the same structural reality, a global event operating at a scale where complexity itself becomes a risk factor. And in such a system, even well-intentioned strategies struggle to function as control mechanisms, because they are constantly reacting to outcomes rather than shaping the conditions that produce them. Sustainability plans respond to emissions after the infrastructure is already locked in. Labor negotiations respond to working conditions after contracts are set. Heat protocols respond to environmental conditions that are already baked into venue selection and scheduling. In each case, the response arrives inside the system, but never quite early enough to reshape its foundational design. And yet, despite all of this, the tournament will still begin. The stadiums will still fill. The broadcast feeds will still go live. The players will still walk out into the same spotlight that has defined every World Cup before it. This is the paradox at the center of modern mega-events. They are capable of absorbing criticism, adapting policies, issuing revisions, and acknowledging concerns, but they are not structurally designed to stop themselves once the momentum of execution begins. At that point, the system is too large, too interconnected, and too globally synchronized to pause without collapsing the very experience it is meant to deliver. So instead, it continues forward, carrying its contradictions with it, translating them into managed risks rather than resolved problems. Which is why the final question raised by this moment is not really about FIFA alone, or even about football as a sport, but about scale itself. What happens when global ambition outgrows the systems built to contain its consequences? Because in 4 days, when the opening ceremony begins, none of these structural tensions will disappear. They will simply move into the background of something more immediate, more emotionally powerful, and far more visible: the football itself. And that is where the final layer of the story sits, in the space between what is known and what is felt, between what is measured and what is watched, between the warnings that accumulate on paper and the game that unfolds in real time under the lights. The tournament will not stop for its contradictions. It never does. And perhaps that is the most important fact of all. Not that the warnings were absent, but that they arrived fully formed, clearly documented, and still could not change the trajectory of what was already set in motion.